Welcome to Reboot Everything Festival. Hi everyone, my name is Dhananath Fernando. Today we are going to talk about the economy after MMT experiment. What now? As you all recall, we had a big discussion on economy and modern monetary theory that was proposed by some policymakers, that modern monetary theory is the solution for all our economic ills. And now we are having a severe problem of all sorts of shortages. Our foreign reserves are almost negative and people are somewhat suffering. Not somewhat, actually, they are suffering quite a lot with almost all shortages. And even the near future doesn't look very positive, and none of the funding that we expected haven't really turned up as we anticipated. So to discuss and more, we have Dr. W.A. Wijewardena, the former Deputy Governor of the Central Bank, and Professor Sirimal Abeyrathne, a lecturer at Colombo University. Welcome, Dr. Wijewardena, and welcome, Professor Abeyrathne. I just wanted to start the conversation starting with Dr. Wijewardena. Now, what does actually MMT mean? Just to recap, because everyone talked about MMT and we know we are in bit of a problem. Just wanted to recap, Dr. Wijewardena, what is in your view, what was MMT? Is it just printing money or is it deficit financing? What really happened and what is MMT? Just to begin with.
Well, Dhananath, it is actually a representation of the old Keynesian economics theory, under which that many believe that if there's a deficiency in the aggregate demand in the economy, causing a general economic recession, if you can increase the aggregate demand by any way, it will actually create a demand for the goods, and as a result, it will cause the suppliers to supply those goods by mobilizing resources, which would in turn increase the output as well as employment. And for the purpose of improving the aggregate demand, the suggestion was that the government should increase its budgetary expenditure. And the increase in the budgetary expenditure, it was suggested that just by getting money out of the economy by borrowing will not help, because it is actually a redistribution of the existing savings in the economy. Therefore, there's nothing wrong in the government to use its money printing power, so that the government can print money, spend the money on the goods and services in the economy, which would be in the hands of the members of the public. Then they will start spending it. Then what is known as this multiplier effect will take effect, and as a result, there will be a subsequent accelerated economic growth and out of the economic recession of the country. What happened in the recent past was that some of the breakaway groups in the mainstream economies had started preaching that the same Keynesian theory in a modified form can be used. And there were many economists in the Western world who had subscribed to this particular view. And as a result, they had suggested that if people say that the budget deficit is a curse for a country, they say it's a myth, because the budget deficit can be used by a country by printing new money in order to stimulate the aggregate demand and come out of the economic recessions. So this is what had actually happened in the recent past. But if we go back to the old modern monetary theory, actually it's not a modern one, because this was started by John Locke in the 17th century, some Scottish economist, who actually said the same thing. He said that the money belongs to the king. So therefore, he has a right to issue money over and above the reserves that he has to keep for the protection of that money. And he suggested to the government of Scotland at that time, they should issue new money, new coins, which would increase the international trade of Scotland and which would make the Scotland the best country in the world. Fortunately or unfortunately, the Scottish government did not accept it. He had to go to France, and he got the King Louis XIV to accept his particular position. And he experimented with the John Law's theory, and France became bankrupt within a few years. So only after that, people came to realize that money cannot make miracles for a country.
Thank you, Dr. Vivadana. Professor Abhiratna, I just wanted to get your view as well. Now, everyone knows there has been a lot of things have been gone wrong, but is it fair to say it is purely because of modern monetary theory? And if it has a contribution, what is the contribution? What do you think the fair share of modern monetary theory contribution for this crisis?
Yes, it's basically issuing more money, and that will bring the country, a nation, to prosperity. That's the underlying belief of this MMT. I wouldn't even call it an economic theory because it is just an accounting technique. And in fact, if we know the underlying economics, and I don't think anybody is going to believe in MMT. The reason is when we print more and more money or issue more and more money to the economy, aggregate demand will rise, and then it is also in the Keynesian line of thinking, so that to meet that demand there will be production and there will be employment generation taking place, all these things, so that the government can issue more money and then finance infrastructure, finance the government consumption. All these things can be done without borrowing money. So that simply it is. But however, you cannot continue with this without knowing the underlying economics dynamics that is in operation there. But I must also acknowledge that the world economy is going through cycles. So there are boom periods and then recession periods and then sometimes crisis also. So in this cyclical way of movement of the world economy, there are times that the money can be issued in abundance. So the time period that we have passed, probably during the last 10 years or so, it is a period like that because the entire world economy was in a recession. In recession periods, actually the link between money and inflation is getting weaker. But in expansionary period of time, which is the time that the global economy is entering now, that link between money and inflation is getting strengthened. So that actually this fact is now it's very visible. Because of the all over the world, we can see the inflation is on the rise. So it is not that MMT. In fact, even I have heard that similar equation, money equation, which is called Black-Scholes equation, which has caused the US financial market collapse in 2008 and 9. And why? Because it created the situation that if you ignore all underlying economic factors, of course, this is the way that you can rise in terms of your profits and incomes, and so that people start investing on investments and borrowing on borrowings and gambling on gamblings, and everything that they are becoming richer and richer and richer. But that is if we forget the underlying economics, so that the collapse is there.
Professor Sirimal, just wanted to again touch upon now. I saw you have also mentioned sometimes when the demand or when the demand is low. For an example, when there's COVID, everyone was in lockdown, so people are not consuming as earlier. So at that point, there can be some level of MMT, or you can add more money into the system, or you expand. Is it true? Is it a right way to do that? What's your thought on it?
I think when we look at the policy making in line with the global economic cycles, the expansion, the boom and bust. So during these boom and bust periods, actually the economic policy making is also changing in line with these things. So during the expansion period, of course, the countries become more and more spending money, and then the countries, when they come to the stages of growth is slowing down, but the stability is getting affected, then they have to reverse that trend. And when the countries are now going into recessions and going to crisis periods, obviously there is again demand for different kind of policies. In that sense, in fact, as we have already seen, fiscal policy stimulus, monetary policy stimulus, they are quite common in recession periods, in crisis period, because the aggregate demand has fallen, so that it can be the crisis effects can be mitigated using more and more money, pumping little more money. But obviously, it has been the case in developed countries and in developing countries. But by looking at this point, what is happening in the world economy, we cannot say it is the adoption of MMT. Whether people believe in MMT or not, they are doing that because there is no other choice. Therefore, we have done that, but the important point that we need to understand, you cannot do it continuously. There is a limit to do anything.
Dr. Vijayavardhana, now what has happened has happened. Now, how can we overcome this? Can we undo what has happened? Because that argument has also brought out when people said, look, you are printing excessive amount of money. They said, no, don't worry, we can actually reverse that. Can we do that? And what should we do?
Well, you can always reverse whatever you have already done, but at a great cost. Now, for example, this money printing is a misnomer than not, because many people think that what is meant by money printing is that the central banks, printing new currency notes and coins. It is not what is meant by money printing, because it is actually the stock of money that would affect the aggregate demand of the economy, which is the total money supply in the country. Now, if you look at the past 27-month period, beginning from January 2020, there had been an increase in the total stock of money by 4 trillion in Sri Lanka, which is about 53%. And if you want to reverse it, you will have to absorb back to central bank and sterilize the entire amount that had been out there in circulation with the people of the country. For that purpose, you will have to increase the interest rates to a very high level, which would in turn affect the economic growth momentum of the country. And at the same time, it will affect the small and medium enterprises which have to borrow money from the banking sector. So as a result, whatever the mistake that you may have done, you can always reverse it, but at a great cost. I will give you an example, because suppose there's a diabetic, and the diabetic patient has now lost his sensitivity, but if you cut down the calorie intake by that person by a huge amount, the fellow will die. The same thing will happen to Sri Lanka's economy. That is why the monetary economists always warn the central bank, don't do this experiment. Because if you at the final stage, if you try to reverse it, you have to do it at a great cost, and that cost cannot be borne by the economy of any country.
So, Dr. Vijayavardhana, now the Prime Minister had again said we have to print 1 trillion rupees because we can't pay government sector salaries. So the option is, we also can't not pay the government sector salaries. So then otherwise, our interest expenditure is about 70% of our revenue. So what are the solutions? If we have to also pay the government salaries, but we don't have money, you say that we should not print. So what is the solution?
Well, I can go back to this example of this diabetic, because the diabetic patient, if he wants certain amount of calories per day, in order to survive, you have to give that. But you have to sign an agreement with the diabetic patient that I am going to withdraw that calorie supply to you for a period of time. Similarly, if Ranil Wickremesinghe wants to print 1 trillion in order to pay salaries, because he cannot allow the government sector to go bankrupt, he has to sign an agreement with the monetary board of the central bank. Give me 1 trillion today, but I will repay it over a period of say 3 months time or 6 months time. And during that period, Ranil Wickremesinghe will have to raise revenue through some other source. Whether he borrowing from the market or borrowing from abroad or by raising taxation, it may be a combination of that. But he will have to repay that 1 trillion over a given period of time, so that the long-term impact of increasing the total reserve money of Sri Lanka by 1 trillion can be mitigated if he cooperates with the central bank's monetary policy.
Professor Abhiratna, Dr. Vijayavardhana says that the Prime Minister might have to come to an agreement with the central bank. Okay, give me 1 trillion, but I will reverse it through a tax mean. What is your solution? Now we are, as I said, no money, but we have to pay the government salaries. Can't print money, inflation will go again. There will be a problem. What should we do actually?
I like Dr. Vijayavardhana's example about the diabetic patient. And in fact, it is the same thing that I have to repeat in this case as well. Of course, you have a cost, and that cost will be tomorrow, but you have a gain, and that is today. So probably Prime Minister has chosen, okay, I will bear the cost, or people will bear the cost tomorrow, but the public sector salaries have to be paid today, so that I have to get money somehow to do that. So I think even in the history, we have done this quite often, and then for today's gain, that we have sacrificed the future in many ways, and that is one part of the problem that we are in this crisis today also.
Dr. Vijayavardhana, so what would be the cost now if we add 1 trillion rupees? Now already the governor said this month the inflation will be at 40%, and Professor Steve Hankey's indication shows it's 122%, and we are third in the world, just competing with Lebanon. So what is the cost if we add 1 trillion?
Already, I mean, we'll have to look at what would happen to this reserve money, which is being used as the seed money by the banking sector to create multiple deposits and credit. Already, the reserve money level in Sri Lanka is about 1.3 trillion. So, if central bank accommodates the government's requirements by about say 1 trillion more, the reserve money base will go up to 2.3 trillion, and the banking sector in Sri Lanka today will multiply every rupee that is being issued by the central bank as reserve money into 8 rupees as the final level of money supply. So what would happen is the present money stock is about 11 trillion in Sri Lanka, and that will go up to 18 trillion within a matter of say 12 to 18 months. So what it means is the money supply has already increased by 53%. With this Ranil Wickremesinghe solution, it will go up by another 60%, which would mean that we are heading towards the hyperinflation, which is being projected by this Steve Hankey of Johns Hopkins University, and we cannot avoid it. So that is why the central bank governor is very concerned, because we have to look at here, Dhananath, it is the responsibility of the monetary board of the central bank to us, the people, to protect the value of our money. It is not the responsibility of the Ranil Wickremesinghe. Ranil Wickremesinghe's responsibility is to pay salaries. So both of them will have to look at who will affect who and come to a compromise and reduce the burden on the people by way of increasing inflation, and at the same time for him to get his salary will paid out of the money that he would generate through taxation or borrowing from the market.
Professor Abhiratna, what is the solution? Dr. Vijayavardhana says it's the responsibility of the central bank not to allow this, but on the other hand, Prime Minister's responsibility is to pay the salaries. So what we should do? We don't have money and we also have to pay. What is your suggestion?
I think the other solutions are very painful solutions. Of course, in a crisis situation like this, and we have no easy choices, so that if you look at the everything, all these explanations that we have come up with as the source of this current crisis, including MMT or money printing or any other corruption or anything like that, finally we will end up in spending beyond the capacity. That is where we end up always, spending beyond the capacity, whether it is internal finance or external finance, it is the case. So if we go by that argument, obviously the reason, the solution that we need to adopt right now is not to fuel the crisis again, printing 1 trillion money more, but cutting down spending. And that may be even public sector salaries cut down. In fact, ruthless cutting down spending is the only solution at the moment.
Dr. Vijayavardhana, now 70% of our expenditure is for interest payment from our income. So in that case, restructuring the domestic debt is a better option in your view, because if you restructure and postpone the domestic interest payment, if we can have a solution, if we go for that restructuring, then at least we are saving 70% of our income, at least half of it. So can that be financed for the government sector salaries? What would be the pros and cons? And if you were in that seat, which option would you prioritize?
Yeah, Dhannath, out of that 70% part of the interest payment that we make to foreigners, which we have suspended. So that part has been saved for the budget now. In the case of the domestic debt, so far we have not gone to the debt crisis, because we still can refinance it by reissuing it. So that's the advantage that Sri Lanka is having. For example, when it comes to this government salary payments, we always take out the debt repayment part and redefine the budgetary numbers in terms of the actual money outflow from the budget. So what happens is that if there is any problem for the government to repay the debt, domestic debt, it can always refinance it by issuing more treasury bills, more treasury bonds, and generate the required funds in order to pay the interest payment, make the interest payments. But what happens is, there again, if the inflation is going to be hyperinflation, the government will not be able to generate any more funds by borrowing, because the government, the people will lose trust in the ability of the government to maintain the value of the money that the government has produced. It happened to Russia immediately after the Soviet Union broke up in 1991. The Russian inflation rate was 1000% per month, and as a result, the Russian government could not pay the salaries of the people because it could not print any more rubles. Number one, it could not borrow money from the people either. So the salaries were paid in the form of vodka bottles.
Right.
So they had a huge stock of vodka and they paid. Now in our case, our government doesn't have vodka bottles. So that is the problem that we are having.
Okay, interesting. Maybe some other type of liquor in that case. Professor Abhiratna, just wanted to know, so on that context, which option would you prefer? You mentioned we had to go for the painful expenditure cuts. Is there a channel that we actually can cut it down after this MMT experiment? Do you see anything that we can cut down, or either we have to go with the Prime Minister's suggestion and add 1 trillion rupees is more feasible in your view practically?
Still, we are struggling with how to do the plastering work, and we haven't touched the source of the problem. So restructuring debt and suspending debt and printing money and then paying salaries, all these things are temporary measures and which are not at all the solutions to the problem. If you are addressing the source of the problem, there is no overnight solution. In fact, overnight we have to pay for that. Everybody, the public has to pay for that. Why? Because what we are reaping today is what we have sown in the past. Politicians, bureaucrats, businessmen, general public and public sector employees, everybody has contributed to this current problem. So if you are touching the source of the problem, obviously we need to raise government revenue, that we know that, so that we haven't touched how to raise government revenue in a more scientific, more efficient manner, and we are still depending more on complicated indirect taxes. That is part of the problem. And the other part is obviously cutting down the expenditure, and from the top to bottom, massive cut down of expenditure is required. So this is the way out in terms of domestic finance, internal finance. But the same thing has to be done in terms of external finance. There is no other way except export promotion, which is a long-term solution to the current problem. So in fact, while bearing the short-term pain. Short-term means it may be medium-term, another couple of years. And then sowing these very important seeds that we haven't done in the past. And then we can come out this problem in the medium term.
Dr. Vijayavardhana, so since this we are talking about the economy after MMT experiment. Some of the MMT proponents, they have said they have analyzed about the money supply and the inflation of about 100 or more than 100 countries, and the broad money and the inflation, and they have found there's no relationship between the two, and that's why they say it's not related. But according to the classical school of thinking, that's one of the closest relationships in the history of economics between the money supply and the inflation. So what is your answer for that? Is it true? And also there was I think this discussion has come out many a times, whether the broad money relationship versus the inflation. What's actually, how do you analyze this argument?
Well, of course, I also have read this, the articles which have been published by the proponents of the MMT. They have actually analyzed the situation in Sri Lanka, and what they have said is that the current economic crisis in Sri Lanka is not due to MMT. That's what they have said, which is correct. Because the Professor Abhiratna also had written extensively on this particular topic. Our economic crisis is due to structural problems, because we have several structural problems, and as a result, Sri Lanka's economy had been a sick man for a long period of time. What actually happened was that sick man had been given the wrong medicine by the people who had been in power after 2019. That has been the main reason. So what we can say is that we can agree with the analysis made by the MMT proponents that the Sri Lanka's present economic crisis is not mainly due to MMT, but we'll have to at the same time say the current economic crisis, where we have lost all the foreign reserves, where the Sri Lanka's exchange rate is under continuous pressure for depreciation, and the inflation is rising month after month, that has been due to the wrong medicine that had been used by the people who had in power. Even Governor W. Laxman, who was the governor of the central bank from November 2019, in around, say, in March 2020, in a public lecture, he had concluded the lecture saying that he doesn't see any relationship between money and inflation. But now we find in Sri Lanka, the prices are rising, and therefore main reason had been the responsible increase in the total stock of money in Sri Lanka during that period, as I have said, 4 trillion during the 27-month period beginning from January 2020.
What's the argument? Because the global commodity prices have also been on the rising side. We see the crude oil prices have increased, and even the other commodity prices have increased. So the other argument is no, inflation is not okay. Maybe MMT has some impact, but also the global commodity prices have contributed. What is your view on that?
Those are, Dhananath, just one-time shock on the economy. When the external prices go up, and to the extent that the country is dependent on imports, country will have to pay a higher price. But not only us, even countries like Singapore, which is totally dependent on imports, they also have a very low inflation rate. Why? Because they had been maintaining their domestic monetary sector at a very stable level continuously, because they had this currency board system continuously in operation, or the central banking system. So countries which had managed its domestic monetary sector properly have been able to go through successfully the one-time shock that is delivered to that country through the increase in the international prices.
Professor Abhiratna, I just wanted to ask your thoughts as well. What is the solution? Dr. Vijayavardhana says there has to be some restrictions on to manage the monetary side of things, and also the global prices haven't really affected countries like Singapore. Their inflation is low, not of course as 40% as ours. So what is your take on the situation?
When a healthy man gets caught up in heavy rain, he might wipe out his head and then sneeze once or twice, and then that's over. But when a sick man is caught up in the same rain, obviously the situation will be far more different from that. So that's I think when we look at the global side also, we know that this money issuing more and more money has gone little too far even in the global economy, and particularly USA, Japan, Western Europe, and even China. These countries have been issuing money enormously during the last 1 or 2 decades or so. But we have seen no inflation even in the global economy until the recent past. Why? Because it was going through a recession. I'm coming back to my business cycle theory. But here we also can make a distinction between rich countries and the developing countries like ours. The rich countries can do that because their currency is internationally accepted also, although they issue more dollars, more euro, and more yen. And it does not have that much impact upon their exchange rates because these currencies are internally accepted. So they can pay for their imports, they can pay off their debt using the same currency. But if we do the same thing, our currency, our rupee is not accepted anywhere in the world. So that when we import, we have to convert it into dollars. When we pay our debt, we have to convert it into dollars. So which means that when we have too many rupees in our hand as a country, and we will also demand for more and more dollars. So which is a cause of exchange rate depreciation as well. So although some countries have adopted this extensive money printing, I'm talking about the Western countries, in order to achieve higher growth, little bit higher growth, and also in order to achieve higher inflation, because they were having the fear of deflation. So we need some inflation. So the situation is quite different from ours. But now, after a time lag, we always say that prices respond slowly. That's a macroeconomic statement, and so that I think we cannot forget that although we printed and issued money massively, whether it is MMT or something else, but today we are paying for that. Even that is part of the world economy is also because of the same problem, I believe.
So the prices respond slowly, and we all have to experience that. Dr. Vijayavardhana, now there are two terms. Now we know inflation is increasing. Always we have been in discussion called flexible inflation targeting or inflation targeting. Could you elaborate what does this mean and what we should do, whether we should go for inflation targeting or whether it's for flexible inflation targeting? I'll come to your suggestion on or your thoughts on the currency boards as well. You mentioned that. But I just wanted to first pick your brain on what does this mean and what is appropriate for us?
Well, what we mean by inflation targeting, Dhannath, is that we fix the projected inflation to a certain level, say 2% or 3%, and we stick to that. Whatever the demand that comes from the government or from the economy, whatever the shock which the economy has been experiencing, we don't care about it. We go along with the same inflation targeting which is being done by countries like Australia, New Zealand, Canada, UK and France.
So you control it through the money supply.
Yeah, control money supply, and they don't actually change the monetary policy stance in response to the emerging situations in the country, and the emerging situation adjustments should be done in the real sector rather than the monetary sector. In the flexible inflation targeting is that we are using the same discretionary money printing power of the central bank, which has been given to central banks throughout the world in order to very quickly respond to an emerging economic shock. For example, if you look at the COVID-19 pandemic, because that was an external shock that has been delivered to Sri Lanka, nothing to do with the central bank of Sri Lanka or the government in power. There, when the economy was in recession, the flexible inflation targeting program will enable the central bank to move a little up, little higher than the fixed inflation target. That is why the Central Bank of Sri Lanka has this inflation band of 4% to 6%. They would try to have it 4%, But of course, if the economy requires certain adjustments and certain flexibility, they will go up to 6%. But today what has happened is that 6% has gone to 30% and 30% will go to 40%. So we are very much above the flexible inflation targeting program of the central bank.
Professor Sirimal, what's your view on that? So what we should actually do in this context in terms of inflation targeting?
I think it's okay as long as central bank has the independence and has the power and authority to act on these things. But if the central bank is supposed to finance government budget deficit, and then if obviously then it can be a suicide for the central bank also, because the central bank cannot do two things together which are contradictory, and the government wants to spend more. Government has to spend more in a crisis situation like this, so that the treasury has no tax income has collapsed, so that the central bank has to finance that and then forget the primary objective of the central bank. So these contradictory objectives, I don't think the central bank can achieve both simultaneously.
Any final thoughts, Dr. Wijewardena? We are talking about rebooting everything. What do we have to reboot in your view on a priority basis?
Well, as Professor Abhiratna has mentioned, in the immediate run, Dhananath, we must have a plan to keep our heads above the water. There's no question about it. But in the medium to long run, Sri Lanka has to come up with a new program to stimulate its real economy, not the monetary economy. For that purpose, I think the government of Sri Lanka will have to come up with a roadmap of maybe 10 to 15 years, spanning over till, say, 2035, to restructure Sri Lanka's economy, the business sector, government sector, all the subsectors in the economy, and cater to what is emerging in the global economy today. So what is emerging in the global economy is the fourth industrial revolution. We are still in the second industrial revolution. So we have to bypass the third and move on to the fourth, which is difficult but not impossible if we have a proper plan.
I thought we are going backwards from the second to the first now with the way that we are.
Exactly, we have gone backward now in the agriculture sector. Yes, you are very correct.
Any final thoughts, Professor Abhiratna? What should be the next before we wrap up the conversation on the monetary side? What really should we do? What are your thoughts on the Monetary Law Act amendments that has been proposed? I would like to know your thoughts.
I think we should always we say, we have to learn from our own mistakes, and that's all what we can say at this juncture. Now our current crisis is our own product, and obviously we are out of the things that I have learned about crisis. Actually, crisis build up slowly, but collapse is very instant because it requires a minor external shock, and we had that shock, not even a minor one, a major one. So that this is what has happened to Sri Lanka, so that we were already we were prepared to collapse by 2020. And then as Dr. Wijewardena also said, then we prescribed wrong medicines to get out of this, and we made it a mess, and so that we actually made it worse than it was about 2 years ago. My worries during the last 2 years, so even more than 2 years, we haven't done anything up to today. We haven't done anything to get out of this crisis. Still, even today, we are talking about how to manage our debt, how to find couple of millions or billions for the next couple of months as borrowings from somebody. So these are the things in our mind, in our policy making. So this worries me too much. In fact, what we have been doing right now, at least right now, is looking at not only to manage the situation right now, but also how to get out of this problem, where we bring discipline to our internal finance, and how do we increase our cash flow in terms of external finance. So these are the two main issues, probably medium term to long term program that it requires.
Thank you very much, Dr. W. Vijayawardena, former Deputy Governor of the Central Bank, and Professor Sirimala Veeratna from University of Colombo. We are talking about Reboot Everything Festival. So today we talked about the economy after MMT experience. What now? That was the views from Dr. Vijayawardena and Professor Sirimala. So stay tuned. We are coming with more discussions like this. So, but don't forget to subscribe us and share and like our YouTube channel so you can watch similar kind of content in future. Thank you.